Sullivan. I'm the Director of Risk Mitigation here at ASI MAC Canada. I'd like to start off by thanking everyone for attending our webinar today. We will be discussing location-based social media intelligence and identifying and mitigating risk within your workplace. Our primary objective today is to inform you about location-based social media intelligence and how platforms like these can offer professionals like yourselves the ability to aggregate, filter, and analyze vast amounts of data in our ever-growing social media playground. In today's business world, corporate security, risk management, and legal organizations require strategic planning to effectively mitigate risk as companies are increasingly facing compliance and ethics challenges within these external threats. And with that said, ASI MAC has partnered up with Sonar, a very trusted leading location-based social media intelligence platform provider. I've asked Anne-Marie Moore, our Manager of Strategic Partnerships, to help support today's presentation as our product expert in the field. Anne-Marie is going to walk us through how we can start to cut through the social media noise. Anne-Marie?
Thank you, Tanya, and thanks everybody else for joining in. As Tanya mentioned, I am from Sonar. I manage our strategic partner program, and I always think that the best way to start a conversation like this is to talk a little bit about stats that are relevant. So one of the things that you'll see within this slide is a number of different percentage stats, and all of them have a fairly common denominator around social media in terms of whether it's played a direct role, both on a positive and a negative side of things, or indirectly as an opportunity in order to mitigate and manage. So if you take a look at some of these numbers and some of these data points, I want to leave that with you as a thought, because I think some of the things you see here could be relevant, related to, or you could certainly relate to from a workplace environment. As an example, a survey done by Risk Management Monitor in the last year and a half of security managers, out of those security managers surveyed, 72% actually believe that employees' use of social media poses a threat to their organization. And I would comment to say that that's not necessarily going to be an intentional threat. A lot of times it has a lot to do with how social media is being used by employees, and their intentions may not at all tie to what the impact is in terms of the outcome. Another key stat, and I think that this is a sad reflection on our society today, but certainly related to the numbers around workplace violence and it being a top threat, seeing it probably more relevant in the United States environment, but I think we're fools in Canada to not be aware of this concern, that 69% of those surveys saw active shooter incidents as a potential top threat. And then a couple of other things related to that, though, is that the role that social media has also played in terms of employees using social media. As an example on your bottom left, and the ruling has just come out around this one, but there were 2 Toronto firefighters that in 2013 were actually dismissed after inappropriate use of Twitter related to a fellow co-worker. And it was just ruled that of the 2, one of them the dismissal held, the other one was reinstated for other factual purposes. But it really just speaks to the aspect of how powerful social media can be related to how it's used, where it's used, and why it's used. And we do need to certainly keep a barometer on it within our employee environment for sure, and as a company. And when I say as a company, I'm going to switch you to the other stat. The TTC ruling that was just earlier this spring. So TTC has a Twitter account that's used to kind of outreach and respond to customer satisfaction issues. And what ended up happening is there was a whole harassment set of activities that took place targeted to some very specific workers. And unfortunately, based on the outcome, it was ruled that the TTC, in fact, did not properly protect its workers from harassment on its Twitter account. So, the impact of this slide is really, there's lots of different ways that social media has enmeshed itself in our communication life and our workplace life. And so then, this is almost, it may seem redundant, but I think it's always worthwhile for us to really try and quantify where social media is for us today. We know that there's a lot of social media out there. End of the day, we are social. It's not going away. Look at the growth of the use of the internet. just within 10 years. It's a 10x increase. I'll call your attention to the bottom left of the slide. The fact that practically 1/3 of the people in the world use social media. That's a huge number. The other thing I think is worthwhile to highlight is if you look at the volume. So on the far right, this is the type of daily volume that is out there when it comes to social media. Instagram alone has 400 million posts a day. 90% of that demographic is less than 35 years old. Twitter, 320 million posts a day. And then overall from an images perspective, which means pictures and videos, we've got 1,800 million plus images that are being put out there in the world of social media. So what does that mean for all of us? And I think there's a couple of things I wanted to highlight. At the end of the day, it really just means that communication is at an extremely high velocity. It's highly decontextualized, meaning that there's no really controls related to what is being said, where it's being said, why it's being said, and it's all inclusive, which means that it's all inclusive in terms of reach, absence of filters, and a lack of boundaries. And there's a couple of takeaways from that that I think is always worth noting because it really speaks to the pervasiveness and the impact of social media in today's world. The butterfly effect, and everybody I'm sure is aware what the butterfly effect actually means. But there's a tremendous example from the Arab Spring that I always like to share because what happened in Tunisia in 2010 really started with a gentleman who sold fruits and vegetables out of a cart. And he did that because the unemployment rates were so high and he had to provide for his family. He was approached by a female police officer who asked him for his permit. He didn't have a permit. She took away the cart. Apparently she slapped him, spit at his face, and left him there. And he had had enough. He went to the governor's office to go back and get his cart. And he wasn't able to get it back. And he was just literally so frustrated that he went out on the street and lit himself on fire. Well, that image was captured. That the videos were uploaded, it exploded through social media. People rallied around it. This is what has been attributed to the triggers of the protests that began. And it started local, went to a national level, and within 10 days, the Tunisian president, Ben Ali, who had been there for 23 years, had to leave the country. And we all know how the story followed from there. It was in a matter of weeks where similar activities started in Egypt and followed with Libya, and we all know still about the ongoing troubles in Syria. And I don't want to oversimplify it, but at the end of the day, a lot of this can be attributed to a police officer slap, a man's frustration, and social media. The other aspect that's also important to point out, and this certainly should resonate from a corporate security kind of focused perspective, is there are no filters. And the challenge with no filters is there's nothing to stop people from saying what they do. There's no barriers or cues. And the overall full senses that we would have in kind of face-to-face communication are completely eliminated. There's no voice tone. And what that does is it tends to free people up in terms of what they say and how they share. And related to that, when you do something like that, we know that once it's out there, and it's very, very hard to retract. And this leads to the third point as far as what is being social. And at the end of the day, now because there are no barriers, there are no filters, today's world, really community is a mindset. There's no physicality that stops people from communicating. It really ends up being like-minded, critical masses where there are no geographic or sociocultural barriers. And frankly, this can also apply within the workplace. So we all know that the social media data that is out there is certainly vast and various. And I'm here to tell you today that you can actually be utilizing social media in a meaningful way in order to further enable your security practices, your security awareness of what you need to protect and secure within your own workplace environment. The challenge with social media, I'm sure we can all appreciate, is we talked about volume. We talked about the variety of those post sources. we've talked about, okay, that's great. All of this information is out there. There's a lot of irrelevant. There may be a few nuggets, but how do I know what to look for? We have also within this world the course of multiple identities. So each different social media network, as a user, they have different what we call handles. Sometimes people take on multiple identities even with a single network. So when you're trying to make connections and understand kind of who is saying what, how relevant and real it is, that is another challenge. And then there's also the aspect of private versus public. So that's a huge challenge. The challenge is connecting those dots, but then the most important thing is then fundamentally, how do we cut through the noise of all of that? And you look at this visual image on this particular slide, and it certainly underplays probably the volume of social media data that would be percolating from a crowd that you see ahead of you. And at the end of the day, if you're trying to cut through the noise, how do you go about doing it? The task is daunting. It's going to certainly look to be labor intensive. And at the end of the day, you're going to miss out unless you find a way to aggregate it, to filter it, effectively curate it, that volume into meaningful ways for what you are trying to accomplish, i.e. getting information that can support decision making and action. So what I wanted to chat with you then about next is, having said all of that, there are social media intelligence analytics platforms available in today's world that can help security, law enforcement. There's great opportunities in the large event management world, in the education world. And these are different than probably what we're all familiar with on the day-to-day. So there's probably some people who have familiarity with perhaps, a Hootsuite would be an example where as a particular user, you've got multiple social networks and you want to kind of track who's saying what or who your followers are and that type of thing. When we talk about social media intelligence platforms that serve the security industry, there's some key elements that we set out to accomplish. At the end of the day, first of all, we have to enable the discovery of the data that you're looking for. And in order to do that, you want to be able to identify specific users, persons of interest. You want to be able to identify within locations social media data that may be relevant. And we will talk about some use cases actually around this too. And then the other aspect of is discover timing of when things took place. In addition, the ability to then, with that information, you've got a lot of social media data, you've kind of identified some users, you're looking at locations and timing, but be able to hone in on the keywords, hashtags, topics that are relevant to you. And probably even more increasingly importantly in today's world is being able to aggregate that data real time. The next key element from a social media intelligence platform that you would look for is the ability to then, from that discovery, how do I analyze this data? Because I'm still probably going to get a lot of information and I still need to get it down to where I think it is relevant for myself or for what my team is trying to accomplish. So the ability to take that discovered data and filter it in different ways, whether it's through time windows, whether it's through some of those keywords, whether it's through the people. Also, having the ability to take a look at my data in a very visual form. So you may have a great repository of data that you've kind of pulled in, but I don't know what I'm looking for. And so being able to have categorization of data through visual analytics is another great feature in a social media intelligence platform. Being able to identify relationships between users, and I will talk a little bit about an example on that a little bit later. And also identify topic trends and sentiment. The final thing that's really key when you talk about a social media intelligence platform that serves a security and a public safety interest is, okay, I've got data, I've analyzed it, I've gained insight, I've actually got some information that I think then we either need to act on or plan for, then you need to be able to respond. So also as well, being able to take a look at that data and use it to support your decision making, to mitigate those risks and threats, use them to protect assets and people, and being able to deploy resources. And then finally, address sentiment. One of the key elements that is very powerful in social media intelligence platforms is the ability to create geofences. Effectively, a geofence is literally being able to take a virtual map and down to the size of a specific address up to a possible, county, a region, a large event, a country if you needed to, and be enabled to actually draw what they would literally call a virtual fence around that specific region identified and pull only the social media data that applies to that is a very, very powerful aspect of social media intelligence platforms today. With the geofence, once you've mapped that, you pull those posts, you can literally help identify where people are, where possible threats and or risks may originate. So the best way to move beyond something like this is to actually use the case study and talk through it. One of the things I'm going to share with you is definitely not, it's not one around a specific client that we have. I wanted to share something that we could really articulate how a geofence would work, how it could be used to literally identify a potential threat and or risk. And we're going to start out actually with a geofence that was put around the Palace of Auburn Hills, which we all know is where the, well, maybe some of you don't, but I'm a basketball fan. I know that the Detroit Pistons play there. And the geofence was drawn around the Palace of Auburn Hills. Okay, so in doing that within the tool, what ends up happening is all of the social media data for that particular time period that you specify is going to be gathered. When we did this in this particular case, we actually, along with that geofence, put some keywords in. I thought, what will be important keywords that we'll be interested in from a security perspective? And some of the keywords that were put in were security, violence, mad, angry, yell, drunk, smoke, smoking, steal, creep, strange, scared, booze, bite. So I think you get the gist of it. And lo and behold, in pulling that information, we literally found a posting of an individual within the locker room of the Detroit Pistons, fundamentally taking a selfie, saying security guards are coming, and he wanted to take a selfie before he left. It was through drill down on the actual post and making connections with the social media handle. This gentleman unfortunately had his location services on, and from there we were able, using our social media intelligence platform, we were able to take that information and drill down to the fundamental metadata associated with it. So I've obviously blacked out this young man's name, but by putting on his location services, us doing the search related to those specific keywords, we were able to identify exactly where, so verify that it was pretty obvious that it was in the Detroit Pistons locker room, but there was also a name associated with this individual. And that was fundamentally utilized to track down location, where this individual lived, and from there the law enforcement folks certainly took it over. But the illustrative aspect of this is that if you look at how this started, we fundamentally started within our social media intelligence platform. We drew a geofence around a specific location, the Palace of Auburn Hills. We used keywords and the date time frame based on when we wanted to look for this information, which was around a particular game day. And because of the data that came up, because of the keywords, we were actually able to identify a piece of interest intel to pursue further, and it ended up being a crime activity, but it certainly illustrates the power of what can actually happen and result from using geofence and a social media intelligence approach and software to glean some information. So what does that mean when we start talking about social media intelligence and corporate security. There are a number of use cases, and I'm hoping that on the phone and as you're looking at this information, you're already starting to think about how that could be used to enable your security and risk management practices within your organization. And we certainly can speak to the fact that there are examples from a workplace safety and security where this would be applicable. And let's circle back to some of those stats that I had shared earlier. I don't know if you recall, but there was a number of 35% report workplace bullying. 62% of security managers believe that workplace violence is a top threat. 69% saw that active shooters were a potential threat. You saw also the TPC example. So at the end of the day, if you think about that, the ability in a facility to fundamentally draw geofence around, and again, I'm going to reinforce that from a media sonar perspective, all of the social media data that is gathered and accessed is publicly available. This is not anything related to people's private networks, their private communications. It is fundamentally social media data that has been put out to the cloud. It has been posted as public. But in doing putting a geofence within a targeted facility within your organization and making sure from a due diligence perspective that you are aware and at least can have detection or insight to possible threats, possible cyberbullying comments. If there seems to be some form of an indication of a very disgruntled scenario and it's taking place at the workplace, there are great use case applications for using a social media intelligence platform to try and detect that type of activity. Another use case is loss prevention. So unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, people who like to steal things sometimes also like to brag about it, and we have had examples where it's a foolish gesture. However, the individual in making away with certain products that might be company assets made a point of putting something up from a social media perspective. The other thing that is not lost on all of this too is that there are definite scenarios where as well it may not be the actual individual, but because of their particular friend network and what they're publishing out, being able to gather insight in terms of activities that perhaps their friend took part in the workplace, that maybe the work employee didn't post, but their friends certainly did. Again, is another way to have some form of visibility and line of sight. It doesn't mean that those types of things happen, but it certainly gives a company a sense of possible activity, possible sentiment that is out there. And that leads again also into the facilities, assets, and IP protection. So Media Sonar has at least two fairly high-profile corporate clients that absolutely have geofences around their major facilities around the world, and their entire intention is to ensure that, and it truly is very much a due diligence practice. They've got their physical security elements, they've got their cameras, they've got all of the things that would normally be in place in a physical security solution, but as one added layer of measure and due diligence, they are also doing the same thing from a virtual fencing perspective as far as gathering publicly available social media data within the area. Another interesting example is executive protection. And again, I will share an example that we do have one corporate client that uses this quite actively. And interestingly, it's not just about the travel itineraries of these executives. And if you're not making the connection, the idea of having an itinerary for an exec, knowing where they're going to be, being able to pull in social media data in advance of them arriving so that you get sense of sentiment. If you have perhaps some known persons of interest that you want to make sure you understand if there's any activity around that, is very definitely a direct application of using a social media intelligence platform for exec protection. But we also have a client who utilizes it even within the residence of their executives and the neighborhoods surrounding it to just ensure, again, is that additional private security aspect, that they are keeping a pulse on any types of opportunity of risk or threat that may be out there related to their executives' private residences. And then the final one is around crisis management. So I don't think, I think all of us have enough of the daily news related to whether it was the shootings in Munich, we had, within Canada, our major forest fires out in Fort McMurray. There were fires in California in the past year, and actually in California, again, Media Sonar was utilized. And this is very kind of a unique example, but it just speaks to taking social media and using it in the, in an application in a way that you intend it to be used. There were issues with the California fires with drones, and people had drones up in the air taking footage. Probably for all the right intentions, they wanted to get footage out on the internet. And what was happening, though, is some of these drones were interfering with the firefighting activities, and they could not track where these drones were coming from. And Media Sonar was actually used because one of the drone users was posting their footage up into YouTube, and based on the YouTube information that was there, we were able to identify, again, the user. From there, some more intel and investigation, track down who that actual person was, and lo and behold, law enforcement was able to knock on the door and just say, you need to bring your drone. Pardon me, you need to bring your drone home. So I think that's a really great kind of public safety positive example too, as far as how you can use the social media intelligence platform to serve your purpose. So having gone through this and tried to give you some teasers related to how social media could be used in a corporate security practice, one of the things I will certainly leave with you is that, probably as recent as 5 years ago, the utilization of social media from an intelligence perspective was very low. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that it was too ominous. The data was vast. There really were not the powerful analytical tools out there to help use it. Everybody felt that social media was going to play a role, but there was a survey done, and I think it was in around 2011, where it was less than 30% of law enforcement was actually using it. Now that number is upwards of 60 to 70%. And generally speaking, in the security and law enforcement world, 85% is the number that they're saying from an intel perspective that is actually sourced through open source intelligence. So it is certainly becoming part of today's essential security toolkit. And I always like to, use the phrase that even if it's not a question of finding true silver bullets, which there are out there, it certainly is, I guess, important for us to look at it from a due diligence perspective. If you know the data is out there and you know ways to be able to pull in that data to help round out your security practice, that it behooves you to take a look at it for sure. Now, having said all of that, analytics can only get you so far. There's always that human capital component to it, and the power does come from the expertise. So the expertise of a security management team that knows what to look for. They know what they're, whether it's if you're dealing with things like activists, or what the key kind of buzz issues may be if you're in a union environment, or the types of events or the types of public sentiment that you might be anticipating based on what you're doing within your company. That is definitely coming from the intellectual capital of the security team, the organization. So the power comes from that expertise and applying it into a social media intelligence platform such as Media Sonar. And if you don't, and as far as using the actual platform, there certainly is that need to make that connection between what we believe is the expertise from a knowledge of our industry and what we're looking for, applying it into a tool, and whether that's within your own security management team, whether you actually have some technological folks that are focused on doing those types of analytics, or you have a security solution provider, such as the likes of AFIMAC, that is in a position to deliver value and enable you from a social media intelligence analytics perspective to make what you do on a security management standpoint better moving forward. So that is what I wanted to share with all of you today. One of the last slides that I will pull up is to make sure that for all of those people on the phone, they know that they can contact Tanya if they have any more questions related to the content that I just delivered, or learning a little bit about Media Sonar, and probably more importantly how AFIMAC can help them with this.
With that being said, thank you so much, Anne-Marie, for your time and your insight on this topic. We certainly appreciate you guiding us through this discussion, and it was very informative. I can appreciate the importance of generating immediate, rich, real-time information in an intuitive, easy-to-read user interface, which I certainly believe is valuable in today's corporate and security world. The dominance of social media has changed how we do business, and success within this ever-changing landscape comes from within one's business risk mitigation tools, and this is very helpful with that. I'd like to open it up at this time, and we would be happy to facilitate any questions from the group in the event that you have one. If you would like to certainly let us know, we would be happy to help. We'll just give everyone a few minutes in the event that they want to type the question in there, and with that being said, in the event that there isn't, you can always feel free, like Anne-Marie had said, to reach out at a later time. We will certainly try our best to get the information out to you in terms of the webinar and present the material as such. While we're waiting, Anne-Marie, I have a question for you. Perhaps you could tell me, in terms of Media Sonar and the intel that you guys are using in terms of this risk mitigation tool, what is one of the things that you guys find most challenging in terms of the social media world and how to correlate the data and use the information?
So one of the most powerful and yet most challenging areas is around link analysis. So one of the things we didn't touch on in this webinar is really kind of showcasing our tool perspective, but I think link analysis is a very powerful aspect of social media intelligence platforms. And what link analysis really means is that being able to link people and identifying their networks, identifying the strength of their networks, but also from a topics perspective. So one of the things that Media Sonar has in our tool today that we think differentiates a little bit related to our focus on security and public safety is we've built out a whole topic modeling engine. So we have a data science team, and they fundamentally look at associations between words. And I touched earlier on the visual analytics. And one of the ways you can look at your raw social media data is to group it by topics. And it's very powerful because we've invoked machine learning. So once we've built out some of those word associations, what ends up happening is the tool itself starts to bucket and categorize things in possible topics for that information. And it's very, very powerful. It's also very, very challenging because there's a lot of context, right, around keywords, buzzwords, etc. But again, the machine learning aspect of it is the more we plug in the data, the more we build in some of those relationships, the smarter the machine learning becomes and the more that data that comes. So being able to do those types of things, I think is the most challenging, but we also recognize some of the, the must-haves from a leader in the industry perspective.
Very interesting. Thank you. And if you don't mind, let's talk a little bit about the privacy settings. I know that in the social media world, in terms of the interfaces and how things are changing, a lot of people do or actually engaging in turning them off or on those privacy settings. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of this type of interface and how that correlates to it?
Yes. So from a very practical aspect, and probably certainly more in the Western Hemisphere than more of the developing hemispheres, the percentage of location-based social media data is on a decline for all of, at the end of the day, we're all people for all of the right reasons. So there were numbers probably within the last 5 years or so where the location services was probably at least 15% of all data. I heard a number quoted at a talk I was at just recently that they probably think it's more in the 5 to 7 range now. That being said, that's still a lot of data. We saw the volume right on those first couple of slides. There's still a lot out there. And again, that speaks a little bit to some of the link analysis aspects of things. That you may not have locations, but once you identify, you know, you're able to do some people analysis, you'll be able to do some topic analysis. You can start to build out possible location data from that. The other thing, though, is that, interestingly, today's everyday user, you know, Pokemon Go has actually put a peak in everybody having their location services turned on. And, you know, those types of things, as new apps come in and you have your blips of location being on, you're able to pull that kind of data because it means their GPS is on.
Fantastic. Well, I know it's certainly a lot of the questions that we get in terms of people turning us on and off and what information can be gleaned. So that's really helpful. And I guess lastly, and most importantly, I think as social media changes, and obviously the risk mitigation around that is definitely needed in today's society. What are you finding probably the biggest incline in terms of those? For example, I know YouTube, I know Instagram, you showed us those numbers, but what is on the incline in terms of what people are using and what is changing out there? Because I know it's always going to change and there's always going to be new things that need to be added and we need to kind of embrace and look at in terms of the monitoring.
Yeah. So Twitter, I would say, I don't want to say it's plateaued, but we know that Twitter it's certainly not on a growth incline like it would have been a few years ago. And again, the answer to that somewhat depends on the demographic and the geographic.
Okay.
Hands down, Twitter still is probably the #1 kind of vehicle because of the way that it also links into the other social media networks. So, you know, somebody who wants to share their YouTube will also tweet it out, right? That type of thing. Media Sonar has just recently added Periscope, which is a real lifetime video streaming. And that is another, it's on a growth plane. We have to stay on top of these things all of the time. I would suggest, though, that there are a number of the more, I don't want to call them private, but the Snapchats of the world, which are very much time-capsuled social media shares, certainly pose their challenges for a social media analytics provider like Media Sonar, because you have to not only want the fact that, you know, being able to access that public data, and Snapchat today is actually is a private scenario, but it's the ones that are coming out with the timestamp. So Periscope, as an example, is an example of a time-stamped one. The user defines how long you're making it available, whereas when you tweet something, it's out there, right? So though, you know, I don't know if I really truly answered the question, but I think the growth is coming in the ones where the user's a little bit more in control or aware and controlling how long they've got their information out there. And definitely some of the video types, we'll see a lot more where kind of real-time video sharing is going to grow.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Very interesting. I don't think we have any questions at this time. So with that being said, once again, thank you so much, Anne-Marie. We'll conclude the webinar at this time, and we want to thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.